Hello, beautiful people, and welcome! Hi! To the Varesa pre-release analysis! Varesa is an electrocabalist who is designed around a relatively straightforward but seemingly complicated gameplay loop of using your skill into your plunge. In practice, she's going to play very similarly to Game. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. So, her base HP, 12,699, base defense, 782. This is pretty standard, maybe a little bit above standard for defensive stats on a carry. Her base attack, 356, very high. But as is always the case when it comes to character base attack, the base attack itself doesn't mean that much in a vacuum. It only means something when it's contextualized with the numbers on the rest of the kit. Crit rate, Ascension stat, which is also pretty significant, especially on Natlan characters. Natlan characters with a crit rate Ascension are gonna tend to be a bit harder to build by default because of how strong Codex is. However, with Varesa, it won't be as bad as it is on characters like Chaska, because she's getting released with her own signature artifact set, the Long Knight's Oath. 2-piece, plunge attack damage increased by 25%. 4-piece, after the equipping character's plunge attack, charge attack, or skill hits an opponent, they will gain 1 to 2 stacks of the 4-piece effect, up to once every second per type of attack, and each stacks gives you 15% more plunge damage. In other words, when you use your plunge, you gain 1 stack, when you use a skill, you gain 2, when you use a charge attack, you gain 2. In Varesa's case, the thing that sets up her plunge attack is doing a skill into a charge attack that puts her into the air. But we're going to talk more about that later, but all you need to understand for this part is that she gets all of her stacks just by using her kit very easily. Because she has an artifact set designed for her, it means that her crit rate ascension isn't as much of a problem because, well, when you look at characters like Chaska or characters like Molani, crit rate ascension plus obsidian makes it so that with a crit rate weapon, it's really hard not to overcap crit. Even without a crit rate weapon, it is a bit harder not to overcap crit than on other characters. But because Varesa is coming out with her own signature set, and that signature set is not a crit rate set, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. In any case, let's get right into what her kit does. And fair warning, there is a lot of words in her kit, and it sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. But first, we'll say how they write it, but I'll explain it in a way that's pretty simple afterwards. So, normal attacks don't matter. Charge attacks. Consume a certain amount of stamina to headbutt opponents in front, dealing nice aligned electro damage, and using the momentum to leap into the air. Her charge attack makes her jump, and that jump is high enough to do a plunge attack. Plunges from midair to strike the ground below, damaging opponents and dealing nice aligned AoE electro damage. If Varesa is in a combat state upon landing, or if the shockwave from her plunge attack hits an opponent, she will gain 25 nice soul points. She enters the Fiery Passion state upon reaching maximum Night Soul points through this method. Her Night Soul point limit is 40, so she gets 25 of those 40 Night Soul points from doing a plunge attack. Fiery Passion, so when she does enter that state, her normal charge and plunge attacks will get buffs. They will do exactly the same thing, but with more damage. That's pretty much how you can think about it. However, the plunge attack, instead of generating Night Soul points in her buffed state, will consume Night Soul points. Skill! With footwork swift as lightning and fierce as thunder, Varesa displays the true spirit of a Luta Libre, rushing forward a certain distance and dealing Night Soul aligned electro damage to opponents in her path. After using this skill, Varesa gains 20 Night Soul points and gains the follow-up strike effect. She has increased interruption resistance, and when doing her normal attack, she will quickly unleash a charge attack that doesn't consume stamina, and you can only use that once. If you tap, it's a small dash. If you hold, you get the exploration version of it, where she just goes fast. When she is in the sudden onrush or Fiery Passion state, it's counted as being in Night Soul Blessing. Fiery Passion, this is just repeating. This is just telling you what the rest of her kit already tells you, which is the ways to get Night Soul points. And same thing here, it's telling you what the rest of the kit is already telling you, which is that when she's in her Fiery Passion state, her things do more damage. But also, when she does a plunge attack in her Fiery Passion state, it lets her do a special elemental burst. For the purposes of talking about Varesa in general, I'll be referring to her elemental burst as either the small burst, short burst, special burst, or Q2. Q2 because it's the second version of her Q ability. I might use the terms interchangeably by accident, but just know that when I use one of those words, I'm talking about the special elemental burst she can do sometimes. Fiery Passion lasts up to 15 seconds, but that doesn't matter because in practice, it will end when she runs out of Night Soul points. And as a reminder, when she does a plunge attack in her Fiery Passion state, she consumes all her Night Soul points. What that means is that you use your skill generates 20 Night Soul. The skill lets you do a special charge attack, which makes you jump, and then you do a plunge attack. Plunge attack generates 25 Night Soul. You're now at 45, which is more than 40. You filled it up, and that activates the Fiery Passion state. Now, in the Fiery Passion state, use your skill again. When Varesa enters the Fiery Passion state, she will obtain an additional charge of her elemental skill, and its damage will be increased. So that second skill is pretty much just free. It doesn't count as a default one. She starts with 2 charges, but all you have to keep in mind is that the skill that you use while you're in Fiery Passion is effectively free. You get it from entering Fiery Passion, and it doesn't really count towards your cooldowns. So, you're now in Fiery Passion, you get a free skill, you use that skill, again, use the charge attack, input a normal attack, which does a no stamina charge attack, makes you jump, and then you do the plunge attack in your Fiery Blessing state, or Fiery Passion state, which consumes your Night Soul and deals more damage. After that, you're back to where you started, and you just do the same thing again with a second charge of your skill. One thing though is, if you have enough energy, after that special plunge that consumed your Night Soul, you can do the Q2. You can do the special Q, which means that her base gameplay loop is you skill, charge, plunge, then you do the same thing, but after that second one, you use a Q2. After that, you just repeat the exact same thing. There's a bit of nuance that goes into all the long words and so, Codex buffs damage of characters that are in Night Soul's Blessing. But she only enters Night Soul's Blessing once her bar is full, because that's when she enters Fiery Passion. That means that there's going to be a portion of her damage that isn't buffed by the 2-piece of Codex. On top of that, Codex only gives a crit rate after you consume Night Soul. But if you were paying attention, you may have noticed that she only consumes Night Soul when she does her second plunge attack. The first skill, charge attack, and plunge happen before you consume Night Soul. The second skill and charge attack also happen before you consume Night Soul. So almost half of her rotation is not going to benefit from the Obsidian buff if you do default rotations like this. Next up, Elemental Burst, Glory Vent. Leaps into the air before using the momentum of the drop to unleash a powerful flying kick, dealing Night Soul aligned AoE electro damage to opponents. After using this skill, Varesa's Night Soul points will be restored to maximum, and she will enter the Fiery Passion state. Unless your skill is on cooldown, this doesn't really matter too much, because you can fully generate your Night Soul from one skill into Plunge. In the Fiery Passion state, Varesa's Elemental Burst will deal a greater amount of Night Soul aligned AoE electro damage. If we look at the numbers on it, the default burst motion value is actually really low, which means that you could use it to generate Night Soul, but if you want to use the big burst, it does a lot less damage than if you were to use that big burst after you've generated Night Soul. The problem is that even that buff number is still relatively low. Additionally, she will briefly activate Apex Drive after using a plunge attack while in her Fiery Passion state, so that's what was mentioned earlier. After she does an enhanced plunge, so every second plunge that she does, she can use the Q2. So Apex Drive, which is the status effect that you get that allows you to use the Q2, increases Varesa's interruption resistance. This is actually kind of a big deal because the amount of time that you have to use your Q2 after the plunge attack isn't that long. So if you got knocked back right after doing that plunge attack, that could be a problem, so the resistance to interruption here is kind of nice. While affected by Apex Drive, Varesa can ignore her Elemental Burst cooldown and consume less energy to use a special burst. So this special burst, right, whether your burst is on cooldown or not, you can use, as long as you have the energy for it. You can only use it once after that special plunge. That special burst is basically just a glorified plunge attack. So it works pretty much exactly like a plunge attack, but it does more damage. And you don't have to set it up by jumping or using a charge attack first. Well, you do have to set it up by doing another plunge attack first, but you don't have like jumping animations on top of that. Ascension passes. After using her skill, she gains Rainbow Crash. During this time, when she uses a plunge, that plunge deals more damage. And this additional damage is additional motion value to the plunges. So in other words, what that means is that plunges that are done after skills do more damage than plunges that are not done after skills. So this is something that buffs the plunges, but not the Q2, not the special burst, because you don't use a skill. You don't use a skill for that. Another thing to keep in mind with this is that if you're trying to use your plunges more often, so for example, if you're trying to use her with Xianyun and just ignore the skills entirely, you are losing out on a good amount of motion value because you're not benefiting from this. Because of that, even if you do end up using her with Xianyun, you pretty much never jump. Ascension 4 passive. When a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul burst, Varesa's attack increases by 35% for 12 seconds, max 2 stacks. Each stack's duration is counted independently. This says the hero twice returned, but this is more like the hero twice returned, but only if you have Shiloden. By default, Night Soul Burst has a cooldown that depends on the amount of Natlan units you have in your team. With 1 Natlan unit, it's 18. With 2, it's 12. With 3, it's 9. Most of the time, you play her with at least one other Natlan character, so the cooldown is either 12 or 9. So it's full uptime, and there may be some overlap between the first and second stack, but the overlap, if you have 3 Natlan units, is at most 3 seconds, in practice less than that. However, Shiloden has an effect that triggers an additional Night Soul Burst when she fills up her Night Soul bar, which means that with Shiloden, you get the second stack very easily. Personally, I think that's an omega scummy way of going about it, but in practice, as we're gonna see when we start talking about the teams, Shiloden isn't really part of her best teams anyways. So, what do I think about this kit overall? Honestly, I'm a little on the fence. Varesa is a character who's almost really cool, but falls a little short design-wise of what I'd want to see. The idea of having a special burst that doesn't have a cooldown, in my opinion, is really, really cool. But the reason why it's cool is because it allows for some interesting interactions with characters that generate a lot of energy, and with builds. It effectively gives you a way to directly correlate the amount of damage you're doing with what your energy generation is. Instead of energy just being a yes-no type thing, do you have enough to burst, yes or no? And you just have to reach the threshold for ER and for energy generation where you have enough, and that's it. It could theoretically allow for some interesting dynamic usage of energy generation, where in some teams you use burst more often than in others. And I think conceptually that's really, really cool. The problem is she can only use her special burst after the enhanced plunge attack, which only happens after 2 skill charged plunge. Which means that while it doesn't have a cooldown, it kind of does. That's not to say that there's no novelty in using a burst twice per rotation. Even with the way that it's done, the fact that the burst effectively costs 30 but has a 70 energy limit means that when you're temporarily against an enemy that doesn't drop any HP particles, right, on a lot of teams, that means that you need to build higher ER on your characters, because if you don't, when you're against those types of enemies, you won't have enough energy. But with Varesa, because you started with 70, you can still do like 3 rotations, maybe even 4 or 5, before you don't have enough energy to use your burst. Another interesting thing with her, she does not lose any of her things when you swap out of her. And that's relevant for 2 different reasons. Number 1, it means that if you're using units that have very short buff duration, you can swap out of her to go refresh those buffs. In other words, we're gonna have to talk about Sarah. The second way in which this can be important is you can do an E-charge plunge before your setup, then go do your setup and then back to Varesa. And if you do, it means that your first E-charge plunge is going to be the enhanced one that allows you to do your Q2 instead of having to wait for your second one, which is especially relevant if you're using Obsidian Codex, because it means you get the Codex buff a lot earlier than if you did the default rotation. And the third way in which it's very relevant is it allows for her to slightly extend her rotation by borrowing from the next rotation. At least when it comes to the first 2 rotations, you can do 5 skill charge plunge instead of 4, which means she has the potential to synergize better with units that have longer buff uptime and also longer cooldowns, but it's an optional thing for her, which allows her a lot of rotational flexibility. Unfortunately, because of the specific synergies she has with certain units, that added rotational flexibility kind of just isn't really enough to give her that much team flexibility. And the biggest reason why she doesn't have that much team flexibility is because of her ICD. Varesa's skill, charge attack, and Q2, the special burst, all share ICD, which means that in aggravate teams, generally, you'll get a relatively low amount of aggravates. You'll get an aggravate on your plunges at least, but you're also going to have a decent amount of attacks that don't aggravate. On top of that, she's also a relatively slow hitter to begin with, which means that the total amount of aggravates that she gets over rotation is honestly generally at most something around 10. On top of that, her actual motion value numbers are pretty high, which means that she's generally going to synergize better with characters that actually provide buffs to those numbers than with characters that allow allow you to get damage externally through reactions. As a reminder, aggravate and spread are additive reactions, which means you don't gain more value from the reaction based on the amount of damage that the character is doing at a baseline. The damage from aggravate is buffed by your stats. It's buffed by EM, crit, and damage percent. Not by attack, but by the rest of your offensive stat. But it's not dependent on the amount of damage your attack does without the reaction, unlike Melt and Vape. Because of that, generally, the character that has fairly high base numbers and not the best elemental application will tend to synergize worse with Aggravate. Does that mean that she's not playable in Aggravate teams? Not really. But it does mean that she has better synergy with other teams. Anyways, we can move on to what we do for every pre-release. Weapons. Vivid Notions is probably the most blatant example of signature weapon power creep that we've had in a pretty long time. If you followed anything related to speedrunning, something you may have noticed is that a lot of speedrunners end up using Widsith instead of characters' signature weapons, because in a lot of situations, for the rotation where you get Widsith with the right buff, Widsith is better than the signature weapon. The first time, that's not the case, and even if you're looking at Widsith, while its best possible buff is active, it's worse than Varesa's signature. A big reason for that is because Varesa gets a lot of stats just from existing. Her passive gives her attack. She synergizes very well with characters that buff her attack. Her artifact set gives her a massive amount of damage percent, and she also has synergy with characters that buff her damage percent even more. It means that she's really saturated in attack and damage percent buffs, but not all that saturated in crit. And so getting crit from a weapon instead of damage and attack buffs is pretty good. Vivid Notions is a pretty decent amount ahead of the other options, and it kind of pisses me off. That may not be something that affects you more than usual, though. The main reason why it bothers me so much is because I really don't like when there's a big gap between signature and other 5-star weapons, because a lot of people end up going for weapon banners or at least getting 5-star weapons from standard, right? And a lot of people end up with a 5-star weapon, but only being able to use that 5-star weapon on one character is pretty cringe. And if every new character that you get, you have to choose between getting the signature weapon or using the other 5-star weapon that you have, but it's barely going to be better than the 4-star options, I think that's really tragic. And then on top of that, there's also the fact that this catalyst is like not going to be all that good on anyone other than her. With all of that being said, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that she needs this to be good. Anyways, her signature, Vivid Notions, high base attack, crit damage substat, the passive 28% attack unconditionally, and then when you use a plunge, you gain crit damage on that plunge. When you use a skill or burst, you gain crit damage for your plunges, but it's only for the next plunge. Now, as far as I'm aware, the special burst does not count as a plunge attack type. The damage type is plunge damage, but the attack type is not plunge attack. So I don't think you will get this 28% damage on the Q2, on the special burst. So what that means is that you get 68% damage to your normal plunges and 40% for your special burst, because each normal plunge is preceded by a skill. Her plunge damage is a very large majority of her damage, which means that considering the percentage of her damage that's coming from plunges and from the special Q, which is also a plunge, this is the equivalent of around 45 crit damage overall. So it's 28% attack and about 45 crit damage. Anyways, let's talk about her other option. Her next best weapon is actually generally going to be Lost Prayers. But there's not that big of a gap between Lost Prayers and the other 5-star stat sticks. Lost Prayers and the 5-star stat sticks that have somewhat synergistic stat lines or passives are generally somewhere between 10 and 15% above the free-to-play craftables. And the ones that don't have particularly favorable stat lines, so namely that's the ones with high base attack, low substat, and a passive that doesn't do anything, like Wanderer's Bell, they're gonna be closer to like 5% better than the free-to-play default options, which isn't great, obviously. So the ones that have favorable stat lines, or like somewhat useful effects, are Lost Prayers, Kagura's, Cash Flow to some extent, Tome, Surf's Up. These are all between 10 and 15%. Then Atlas, Wanderer's Bell, and Crane's Echoing Call, Chain and Signature are all fine. They're still better than the default craftable, but not necessarily better than Widsith. They're still better than R1 Widsith, but not really better than R5. One caveat I wanna add to this is that some of these weapons give you energy, and in most cases, that's kind of irrelevant for Varesa, because her energy requirements are not that high, often trivial. However, with Constellations, her base gameplay loop can change, and what that means is that if you're going for her Constellations, some of those 5-star statistics that provide energy, like Crane's Echoing Call, get a little bit of a boost. That being said, her Constellations are not really better than her signature, and none of these weapons that give energy are better than her signature when you have the Constellations. So it's a very minor point, because usually if you go for cons, it's because you already got the say. Unless you're going for cons because you're going for Iansan Constellations if Iansan ends up on her banner, which is actually very possible. Anyways, next up, Widsith. So Widsith is the best 4-star statistic. It also has the advantage of if you're killing enemies in an odd number of rotations, so 1, 3, 5, performing better than calcs say it does, because Widsith alternates between having its effect active and inactive on every other rotation, right? So the first rotation has the buff, but the second one doesn't, and then the third one has it because it's a 30-second cooldown on it. So if you're taking an odd number of rotations to clear, Widsith's effect is gonna be better than the sheets consider it to be. On top of that, even if you're taking an even number of rotations to kill, unless you're killing them exactly at the end of your even numbered rotation, you had a full rotation with the buff and then a part of a rotation without it, which means that it's still a bit more than 50%. But if you get the EM buff, you cry because it's completely worthless. Next we have Blackcliff. Blackcliff without stacks is worse than her craftable. Blackcliff with 1 stack is about as good, and it takes 2 stacks for it to really be better. So don't use Blackcliff. At least she is going to represent a good portion of your team's DPS. Blackcliff stacks are only gained when the character wearing Blackcliff is the one that gets the finishing blow on the enemy. So you can only really use Blackcliff reliably on characters that are going to be the one landing the finishing blow. In multi-wave content, if you have like R5 Blackcliff and you get 3 stacks on it, it's actually really strong. When it's fully stacked, R5 Blackcliff is about as good as Lost Prayers, but without a stack, it's noticeably worse than her free-to-play craftable. Generally, I wouldn't recommend using Blackcliff. Solar Pearl is really interesting because the effect on Solar Pearl is not very good, but because Varesa saturates her attack and damage so much, it makes it so that crit weapons, just by virtue of giving her crit, are going to be competitive with her craftable options, even if the effect they provide is really bad. In Varesa's case, Solar Pearl does not buff plunge attacks, and it doesn't really buff her skill either, because she needs to get a normal attack she needs to use a normal attack, which you don't want to do, to buff your skill and burst. So basically, it doesn't have a passive. The thing is, just from being a crit rate weapon, it's about as good as R5 of her craftable option, which means if you already have a Solar Pearl leveled, it's not worth investing resin into leveling up that craftable option, because they're going to be very, very similar in output. Same thing for Sacrificial Jade. Sacrificial Jade is like 0.2% worse than Solar Pearl. It's actually so close that generally between Solar Pearl and Sac Jade, the better one is going to be the one that gets you closer to a 1-to-2 crit ratio. So fine, but not worth getting if you don't already have them, because they're not really better than Flowing Purity, which is her default 4-star stat stick. If we were to order the weapons from best to worst, Vivid Notions obviously is the best one, then Lost Prayers. After that, you've got Kagura's, you've got Tome. The reason why Tome and Surf's Up aren't that far behind is because some of the external buffs that Varesa gets are flat attack buff rather than attack percent. Those flat attack buffs are more impactful on low base attack weapons because they're always the same amount of attack no matter what your base attack is. But if you have more crit damage or crit rate, that same amount of attack translates to more damage. Attack percent buff don't really work like that. Generally, attack percent buffs are about as good for weapons with low base attack as weapons with high base attack. But with flat attack buffs, it's actually enough to make up for not having a useful passive. Unlike Lost Prayers and Kagura's, which have not great, but somewhat useful default passives. And then below that, you've got Cash Flow, and then Bell, Crane, and Skyward Atlas. Next up, you have Widsith. Next up, I'd have Flowing Purity, then the 2 Battle Pass weapons, and then Blackcliff. I didn't mention Memory of Dust. Memory of Dust is going to be below Crane's. Memory of Dust is, I guess, in the same boat as Solar Pearl and Sack Jade, where you can use it if you don't want to use billets to craft Flowing Purity, but that's pretty much it. If you have a Widsith, you're better off using that. Next up, artifact sets. And there's pretty much only 2 artifact sets to think about. Unfortunately, TF is not it. Varesa has 2 9-second cooldown skills, and she gets an additional free skill after each normal skill that she uses. But the thing is, her skill isn't what does the damage. Her skill enables you to do the things that do your damage, which is your charge and plunge. And you already have enough of that because it takes a while to do those things by default without cooldown reduction. By the time you get value from the cooldown reduction on TF, your buffs have expired, so you want to swap out anyways. She is burst reliant, so you don't really want to use Shimenawa's. Mainly, her artifact set is going to be her signature set. We already said her base gameplay loop is skill, charge, plunge spam, and you get your stacks on the plunge set from hitting an enemy with a skill, a charge, and a plunge. So you're going to have almost full uptime on the whole thing. So it's pretty much just 100 damage percent to your plunges, which is a lot. And it's the main reason why she's so saturated with damage percent. 4-piece Oath, best in slot. Codex is not far behind though. If you're not using your crit rate weapon and you're not overcapped on your Codex build, Codex is like somewhere between like 1 and 5% worse if you do the rotation setup properly, and like 5 to 10 worse if you don't. Doing the rotation setup to allow for Codex, which as a reminder is starting before your setup, doing skill dash plunge, does slow you down, and it's kind of cringe to have to remember to do it, but I don't think most people will do it. So because of that, you can think about it as the upgrade from Codex to Oath being very similar to the upgrade from 2-piece to Vermilion on Chao, or the upgrade from Gilded Dreams to Flowers of Paradise Lost on Raiden or Kuki for Hyperbloom. It's an upgrade, but if you already have a really good one of the old set, it will take you a while for the new set to be better. So 4-piece Codex, still good. Technically, if you're using her with Farina, you can also do 4-piece, I shall say. When you do Codex, you don't get full uptime on the crit buff, and you also don't get full uptime on the damage percent buff from the 2-piece. With Maréchaussée, the damage percent buff does nothing. But technically it buffs charge attacks, but like that's such a small portion of your damage that it's very small. And the crit buff is lower, but it will be close to full uptime if you're playing her with Farina. Maréchaussée and Codex are relatively interchangeable in the teams where you're using Farina. Outside of that, you've got 2-piece, or other like 4 sets that are fine, but not like amazing. Other sets that give you stats similar to what a 2-piece gives you. So like DPC gets you 40% plunge damage, which is about as good as what a 2-piece gives you. You can use Vermilion, I guess, if you're using Farina, but it'll be worse than Maréchaussée. But yeah, these are all pretty similar to the 2-piece options, and they're gonna be not very good. Next up, we have artifact stats. Her default build is going to be attack, damage, crit. You don't really want to consider swapping off of crit circlet. There may be some situations where you can consider attack, crit, but it's not going to be on her best teams. Her best teams pretty much all run some external either attack or pseudo attack buffers, so damage gauntlet will tend to be better, even though she gets a lot of damage percent from her set bonus. And finally, we can talk about the teams. Before we talk about the team specifically, I just need to give you a little bit of context about Iansan. Iansan is an Electro Polearm attack buffer. She's a Natlan character, so she can use Cinder City, and she gives you an attack buff that's dependent on the amount your character is moving. Because Varesa is a plunge attacker, she moves a lot, so she'll get the full value of the attack buff Iansan can give. She has a tiny little bit of healing, which is going to be enough when paired with Chevreuse to activate the Flowing Purity effect. You do need to heal off the Bond of Life if you want to get the buff from the Flowing Purity weapon. Iansan plus Chevreuse is generally going to be enough. One of them is generally going to take a bit too long to proc it though, if you're only playing one of the two. The value of the attack buff that she gives is at C0, 690. At talent level 13, whatever, it's 810. Then her C2 adds 30% attack, and her C6 adds 25 damage percent. In a team that takes full advantage of her buffs, right, where you didn't already have Cinder City, you move enough to keep full uptime on the max attack buff, and you're not losing Pyro Resonance from Bennett not being there. The buff she provides tends to be bigger than the buff Bennett provides, but she doesn't have high healing. Her healing is really low. Anyways, Iansan will be quite good in a lot of Varesa teams. As a plunge attack character, she has pretty good synergy with Xianyun. Now, her base motion value is pretty high, which means that Xianyun will not be the only team that she has. But for plungers, Xianyun is a very powerful unit, and so the Xianyun teams will still be good. The thing is, the main thing that makes Xianyun good is that she enables Farina. She enables very high uptime on good fanfare on Farina, and she has VV, obviously. And because of that, the Xianyun teams that don't use Farina are not going to be all that good. So the first type of teams we'll be talking about, we'll mention, is Xianyun plus Farina. Your last slot most definitely should be Iansan. If you don't have her, you can probably get away with using something like Bennett, but it will be worse. In order to talk about how good this team is, I think I need to provide some context over how meta's evolved lately. If Varesa came out 2 patches ago, I would have thought, oh, this is a pretty good character. But honestly, man, I feel like the meta got so warped by Maoika. Getting a second carry that's like head and shoulders above the rest makes it so that if your main reason for pulling for characters is meta, you'll never really have a meta incentive for pulling for any carries. Especially with Iansan's release buffing Maoika unless she gets nerfed before live. Most characters are going to be closer to Ayato's teams than to Maoika's teams, even the good ones. When it comes to just DPS, Nevilet's closer to Ayato than Maoika. Chloride's closer to Ayato than Maoika. Molani's closer to Ayato than Maoika. Because of that, even if a character is good, it's so hard for me to be, like, optimistic, I guess, about their place in the meta. Because, like, if what you're looking for is meta-optimal teams, you're gonna have Maoika on one side and Nevilet on the other. And anything different than that is gonna be, like, way behind. That being said, Varesa is not a bad character. From what I've seen so far, it looks like her output in her best teams is slightly better than Chlorine's. But her team versatility is significantly worse. She has 2 teams where she is better than Chlorine, but she doesn't have Chlorine's ability to fit really well in pretty much any Electro archetype. It's difficult for me to guess if she's going to be easier or harder to play than Chlorine, but she should be fairly straightforward at the very least. Her 2 teams that are better than the Chlorine teams are Xianyun Farina and Chevaleur's Maoika. Unlike Chlorine, Varesa can actually properly make use of the uptime in 18-second rotations, and on top of that, she has better synergy with Iansan than Chlorine does, and Iansan is going to be really nice for these Chevaleur's Maoika teams. The biggest issue is that the less off-field damage you have in Chevaleur's teams, the bigger the gap is between if you have Chevaleur's C6 or not. I'd say that as a general rule, I'm expecting her best 2 teams to be Xianyun Farina and C6 Chevaleur's Maoika, with the Chevaleur's Maoika being slightly better. But if you don't have C6 Chevaleur's, it's a decent amount worse, and it's a lot closer to the other teams. Still above Aggravate, don't you worry about that, but yeah. Other than that, you can also consider characters like Shilonen in the Farina teams. You can play her in like Overvape or something like that, but pretty much all of that is just gonna be worse. So these 2 teams are gonna be good. Obviously, you're gonna have the issue in a Chevaleur's Maoika team where it's gonna be significantly and noticeably worse than a Maoika carry team. If what you're looking for is just meta, you should never be playing Maoika support because she's so much better as a carry than as a support. I'm not entirely sure what to expect out of the Chevaleur's Xiangling teams. 20-second rotations aren't as great for Varesa, but she can make it work. But because you already have Cinder City, Maoika's on Obsidian, so she does a pretty big nuke. All in all, it should still be fine. It shouldn't be that far behind, so Chevaleur's Xiangling is going to be solid. I would expect it to be quite a bit better than the other options with Chevaleur's. I'm a bit curious about Sarah Xiangling teams. Yeah, the biggest issue with the Sarah teams is that you're gonna have to do aim shots if you want to do proper rotations, because you want to buff Maoika's burst, that's your E. You want to buff the first time you swap to Varesa, but then you also want to buff the second time you swap to her, and that means 3 separate instances of getting a buff. So E and burst isn't enough. You're going to need to add a charge attack. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to feel about that. Further testing will be necessary, but if you are willing to do those Omega Scuffed rotations, it should be pretty good. Other than this, right, when it comes to electro carries, you can think about doing Aggravate, Hyper Bloom, just Dendro teams in general. Meh. She doesn't have great application, so she doesn't have great synergy in those Dendro teams. They're still playable if you like her playstyle and you don't have the units to make her other teams work. If you are going to be doing an Aggravate team, I would not recommend doing a team where you focus only on her damage, because in Aggravate, her personal damage is kind of just not enough to carry a team through. You'll need to give Fischl the pants in that team's relationship. Just use Fischl over Iansan, or use both. Yeah, I guess you can also just use both. Iansan should be something you can consider instead of Xianyun, I guess, but like, you can also do some quick bloom stuff. So with Baiju Farina, I guess, if you don't have Xianyun. In those teams, she'll get performance similar to what Sino gets, which is not appealing, let's just say. Other teams you could consider, some people do Mono Electro for some reason. If you want to do like Iansan, Xianyun, Kazuha, or something like that, or Iansan, Xianyun, Fischl, you can consider those things, but because so many of her teams already have one form of Res Shred, getting a second one isn't that great, and between getting an Electro Offfielder that does damage or Farina, you will generally see like noticeably better results from Farina, because she's also buffing you quite a bit. That's pretty much it for her teams. Really, the only teams that I think are actually properly worth considering are the Xianyun Farina team and the Chevreuse teams. You don't necessarily need Mawika, but the Mawika versions will be better. Outside of those teams, she's just not a very good unit. Let's talk about her constellations. C1, the effect of the passive talent Tag Team Triple Jump are enhanced. When performing the special plunge, she will gain Rainbow Crash. When Rainbow Crash is in effect, it always does 150. It's 180. That talent's wording isn't updated yet. In other words, instead of getting 2 procs of 50 motion value and 2 procs of 180 in a default rotation, all of those procs are now going to be 180, but also you will get that passive on your Q2 as well. That's plus 130 twice and plus 180 twice, which is 620 motion value. This is generally less than the upgrade from literally the second best possible weapon for her to her signature. So pretty much no matter what you're starting from, you will see a bigger damage upgrade from getting her sig than her C1. C2, Varesa will enter Apex Drive, which as a reminder is the special state that allows you to use your special burst after using a plunging attack, regardless of whether she's in Fiery Passion state or not. In other words, she can now use her special burst after every plunge, not just every other plunge. When Apex Drive is active, Varesa's interruption resistance will also further increase. Additionally, she will regenerate 11.5 energy when her plunging attack ground impact hits an opponent. Plunging attack ground impact, from what I understand, this applies to the Q2 itself as well. And because you need to plunge to activate it, it means that you get 2 ground impacts per plunge at C2. You regenerate 23. So in other words, her burst cost becomes practically 7, because it costs 30, but you regenerate 23 every time you use it. This also means that if you're using her with Xianyun, you don't need to use your burst your skill anymore, because 1, well, she doesn't need the energy from the skill anymore, and 2, she doesn't need the Knight's Soul points generated by the skill anymore either, because she doesn't need to do the special plunge. I'm not sure if it's better to just spam jump plunge though. I'll have to look at some testing to be sure. This is looking to be a pretty good con, but it's not so good that you would really want to consider it that much unless you already have Sig. C3 is burst talent level. Once you have the C2, your burst does represent more motion value than your normal talent, but it's still not that much over half, so it's okay. C4, when she uses her normal burst, her next plunge attack does 500% more motion value. But if you have more than 4,000 attack, it gets capped as if you had 4,000 attack. Because the C1 makes the special burst cost 7, you now don't need to use your energy for the special burst. So the normal burst can be worth considering with that. Her C4 is what you need if you want her normal burst to ever be worth using, basically. And additionally, if she has either Fiery Passion or Apex Drive active, her burst deals 100% more damage. I believe this is damage percent. So in practice, this is going to be like 30-ish% more damage on her burst. Overall, I'd say usually C4s are kind of bad. For a C4, this is pretty good, but it's not like outstanding. C5 is normal attack talents, and finally C6 makes her get infinite energy, basically, and gets 120 CV on everything, like on her plunges and on her burst. Also, additionally helps with exploration. The main thing that makes this potentially good is that at C4, if you use the full burst without pre-funneling some energy, it's very possible that by the time you do your first plunge, you don't have 30 energy, so you can't do the burst. Because, like, sure, it costs 7, but that's including the energy you get from your special burst hitting the enemy. You still need to have 30 in order to use it, and if you use your burst, which consumed all your energy, then the plunge that allows you to do special burst is going to regenerate 11, but you still need to generate another 18.5. And this makes it so that you won't have to deal with that. But honestly, it's not that much of a problem to begin with, so it kind of meh. In any case, that pretty much does it for the pre-release. Overall, Varesa is a unit who is somewhat strong, but her being released in the aftermath of Maoika makes it very hard for me to want to recommend her for people that pull mainly for meta. She is, at the very least, good enough to compete with Clorinde for the title of best on-field Electro. Like I said, from what I've seen so far, it seems like her best teams are going to be slightly better than Clorinde's best teams, but outside of her best teams, her other teams are really bad, so she's going to be worse than Clorinde and suboptimal teams, depending on what you have available to you, whether it's because you don't own the units or because you want to use them for another character at the same time. She may end up performing worse for you. So that's going to be it. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed. Keep in mind that pre-release content is always subject to change. It's very possible that she ends up getting nerfed into oblivion or buffed to be even better than Maoika. I highly doubt it, but it's possible. If you want to make sure that this isn't out of date, I always try to post the first impressions video, so you can look forward to that. And if you want just more in-depth thoughts on her once she's been released, you can look forward to the post-release analysis that I'll be making. In any case, do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.